thank you very much. Welcome back, and hopefully I can keep you awake long enough after that wonderful lunch to hear the whole presentation. I'm also very glad that they took my request to take the smaller room for this presentation. It's great every seat filled. Okay, it's fairly widely known that there are about 9 species of bats. There are 9 species of bats resident in New York State. I call this slide the Hollywood squares of bats. And if you look closely at the one in the middle, it does look a little like Paul Lynde. But to just go through them very quickly, the little brown bat, once the most common bat species in the Northeast, and please note the use of the term once. The northern, well, let me see, that's the eastern small-footed bat. I'm going to take that back. Wait a minute. We'll go back. That is the little brown bat. This is one of the issues we're going to deal with, and why we did this study is that bats are difficult to identify, especially from photographs. I was right. Little brown bat. This is the eastern small-footed bat. I'm sorry, the northern long-eared bat, soon to be added to the endangered species list federally. And, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's good.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
So which one's that?
Okay, wait a minute. We're going to come back to that one. This is a northern long-eared bat, the upper corner here. Like the tragus in the ear, that's the little process in the middle of the ear that helps them echolocate. The big brown bat, the largest of our cave hibernating bats. What used to be called the eastern pipistrelle, now called the tricolored bat. And this is the eastern small-footed bat. I don't know why I'm striking a blank on this. It's age, isn't it, Mike? We'll come back. And the lower row of bats are a rather different group of bats. You'll notice that they're quite different. The upper bats are all what we call cave roosting bats. They are bats that hibernate in caves, as a rule. And they all tend to be fairly dullish brown or grayish in color. Some of them with a slightly lighter undercoat, but fairly drab in color, and cave roosters. The lower row here, the bottom row, are all what are called tree bats. And they migrate long distances and tend to hibernate in trees or in leaves. The first one here is the eastern red bat, probably the most colorful of our bats. The middle one is the silver-haired bat. It's jet black, but the tips of its hairs are kind of silver in color. And the last one is called the hoary bat. How many folks here know what the word hoary means?
It's like mottled gray.
Mottled gray in color or frosted. Okay, when my 14-year-old daughter asked me what that meant, I told her, well, it's kind of frosted or tipped with gray. And she said, oh, you mean like you, Dad? Yes. She's available for parties. But just knowing that there's 9 species of bats in New York doesn't really tell us a whole lot. They have some of them have very discrete distributions. The silver-haired bat is best known for the Adirondack region. They certainly occur in other places in the state, but a lot of the early studies on silver-haired bats in New York were conducted in the Adirondacks because they were easy to find. Bill Hamilton from Cornell University, in fact, indicated or stated in one of his papers that they were likely to be the slowest flying bat because he could easily knock them out of the air with a stick. We sample differently nowadays.
It's not nice.
Okay, Indiana bats are also very discreetly distributed through the state in very, very specific areas. They're not found anywhere other than the areas that you see shaded here. Although that may partly be due to the fact that we're not looking for them in very many other places. But that's for another day. But Long Island is very unique among habitat areas and climate in New York. It's quite different from the rest of the state. It's certainly a good deal warmer year-round, being surrounded by ocean. It is geologically quite different, being basically a large sandbar. And it does not afford any caves for hibernation. Now, bats certainly do fly over large bodies of water. Red bats have been found 200 miles out at sea, so we know that they are capable of traveling across Long Island Sound. That shouldn't stop them. That shouldn't be a barrier to them. But it may, in fact, impact how they distribute throughout the state. Just to give a little history on bats known on Long Island and in New York State, the red bat has been known since we declared independence from England. It's been known here in the state. When George Washington gave his farewell address, we knew that big brown bats and hoary bats were found here. The eastern small-footed bat has been known since the Monroe Doctrine was written. Does anybody have a good item for 1831? Because I couldn't find a really good stand-up historic event from 1831. But the little brown bat and the silver-haired bat have been known here since 1831. Finally, the tricolored bat has been known since 1834. Another one of the reasons it's kind of interesting to look at bats here on Long Island distinct from the rest of the state is because we are looking at wind power development. Wind power development has been found to impact bats tremendously. The very recent paper came out just this past fall, estimates that approximately 600,000 bats a year are killed by wind turbines in the United States alone. That's absolutely unsustainable. But it's important to know. And so we're going to be looking at how to address that. But that's why we need to know a little bit more about our bat fauna before we start thinking about having wind turbines, for example, here on Long Island.
Is the impact similar to that on birds, or?
What causes it?
Right now, it's thought to be a good deal more than it is on birds. Bats are killed differently by wind turbines, incidentally, than birds are. Birds do collide with them, but they very often are exhausted by circling around the lights from them. Birds navigate by light. So they tend to fly around them, particularly on rainy or foggy nights, and they'll circle and circle and circle until they're exhausted and fall out of the sky. Bats, on the other hand, while it was initially thought that bat mortality at wind turbines was caused by collisions, it was actually found later on that it's not. They get caught in the vacuum behind the blades, and they suffer barotrauma. The air sacs in their lungs explode. And it's a very, very serious problem with bats. Look at that. White nose syndrome. White nose syndrome is a fungal infection introduced from Europe. It was first found here in New York State, aren't we lucky, in 2006 up in Schoharie County. It has since spread to 26 states and 5 Canadian provinces, and very, very rapidly. And they estimate has killed probably somewhere in the range of between 6 and 7 million bats. Mostly affects, almost solely affects cave roosting bats, because it is what's called a psychrophilic fungus. It's cold-loving. It loves to grow at about 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 70% humidity, and that happens to be perfect hibernating conditions for all of our cave roosting bats. This is a distribution map of the spread of white nose syndrome through June of 2012. It has spread farther since that time. And Long Island is not particularly far away. You'll notice by the green shaded area at the east end of Long Island that, yes, white nose syndrome has reached us too. And that was first found here at Brookhaven National Laboratory in 2011. Tim Green found a northern long-eared bat here on Long Island that was infected with white nose syndrome. And that spurred some even further interest in studying our bats, primarily because they were going to disappear. And we wanted to find out a little bit about them before they did. So we decided to put together a little study plan to just go out and start catching bats, doing some acoustic monitoring, looking for echolocation calls, but also doing some mist netting to actually capture bats and get an idea of relative frequency distributions. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was very good about letting us work at Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge as well. And the first year of the work was funded in part by the lab and was funded in part by the Foundation for Ecological Research in the Northeast. So I would very much like to acknowledge and thank them for that funding. So, have a look at the lab. See, we are currently right there, in this room over here. We started out working at the lab, and we picked, I guess it was 4 study sites. One on the south side of the lab, and this was just along some roadways. Bats tend to use path of least resistance when they're traveling through the woods, so they look for open pathways, they look for stream corridors, things like that. So those tend to be very good places to catch them. So we set up nets in forest breaks, between fields, along sides of roadways, along forest edges, and out in the middle of ponds. We went up to the Pine Barrens area up in the northeast section of the lab, and we were actually somewhat fortunate in that when we started this study in 2012, there was a tremendous forest fire in the northeast corner of the lab, so it gave us an opportunity to also some habitat use between burned areas and non-burned areas in the Pine Barrens. The grayed area that you see here, that's the extent of the burn that came in. So we did some of our sampling right within the burn area, and then we did sampling just outside the burned area, and found some really kind of interesting things as far as difference in habitat use among species. Just a little shot there to see what it was like here. How'd you like to be the owner of that lawn? Okay. The third site was within the solar array that was built, I guess, in 2010. Just to get an idea of, we're trying to, the folks here at the lab are trying to determine what kind of wildlife use is occurring in the solar array, so we decided we'd find out what kind of bats were flying around. And primarily set up along the edges because most of the bats that we're working with, some of them will fly out in the open, but you're limited by the technology that we have from the standpoint of mist nets, in that mist nets work best if you can kind of funnel animals into them. For those who are not familiar with mist nets are just very fine mesh nets that look like mist. I can set them up and 10 minutes later walk into them because I forgot I put them there. And luckily bats don't see them very well either, even with echolocation. So they make it a little easier to catch bats. We stack them, they're about 3 meters high each. We stack them 3 high to get just to the bottom of the tree canopy in openings. And we try to fill side to side whatever pathway they're in. And that basically, they don't have anywhere else to go but into the net. Our other study site was down along Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge. This is the Carmen's River, on the south shore, home of Wertheim. And our first study site was on the east side of Carmen's River. It was just oak pine woods, mature successional forest, and we had a nice crossroad there, so we were able to park ourselves right smack in the middle and walk out in 2 directions and pick bats out of nets. The other site was actually near the old home site of the Wertheim family and where some of the old house buildings used to be. And there's some plantations there. It's mixed oak and pine, but there are also a lot of Norway spruce planted in the area. And a lot of the bats that we have are not known to use evergreen forests very often. Not sure exactly why. They just don't tend to be in there. Part of it may have to do with the clutter density in the understory, makes it difficult to fly. Some of it may have to do with insect populations that occur in pine forests as opposed to deciduous forests. But we also caught bats there. Third site at Wertheim was along the headwaters of Yaphank Creek. As I said, bats tend to use watercourses as pathways, not only because they're nice open flyways, but because they tend to have quite high concentrations of insects. And finally, the last one, we decided to throw up some nets right along the edge of the salt marsh on the south side of the refuge, just to see if anything was using the edge of the salt marsh, if we would get any of the larger bats, the hoary bats, things like that, flying out of the open. So just some photos of some of the net sets. Pond sets are one of the only areas you can't cap off the top. There is no overhanging canopy, but you can see we get the nets up fairly high. Those poles are probably 24 to 27 feet high, and the nets go right to the top. That's the set across Yaphank Creek. One possible impact that we did have was that this was a 2-week-long study. That towards the end of our 2 weeks, when we were netting down at Wertheim, as you can see in the background, we got into a full moon. And bats tend to fly a little bit less in a full moon. They tend to stay under the canopy when the full moon is out. No one's quite sure why. It may have to do with potential sensitivity to predation, but we know that they don't fly and they're not captured as frequently during a full moon. In addition to the net sets, we also put out acoustic detectors. These are ultrasonic microphones and recording devices that are able to pick up the ultrasonic calls of bats that, as they echolocate. We are specifically looking for their search phase calls, which they use as they're searching for prey as they fly down a pathway. Those are recorded. They're put through Sonobat software, which interprets the calls, can phonogram the calls, and we can actually identify certain species by those calls. Unfortunately, certain species are very, very close in their appearance and their characteristics and can't be as easily teased out, but most of the ones we have down here can be. So it's a very valuable tool for that. The other downside or limitation of acoustics is that you can have one bat that will fly up and down a pathway all night. So you will record 800 calls from this species, and some folks might look at that and say, wow, we've got an awful lot of those down here. No, we don't. We have one that flew back and forth. So the unfortunate part about acoustics is that you can't identify individuals, so they don't give you an idea of population count. They can give you an idea of activity. Tim Green in the lab, I don't know if he's in here tonight, he's seen this presentation before, but Tim was, of course, very helpful. We had a number of staff from the lab, interns from the lab, folks from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, friends, relatives, and anybody else I could drag out in the middle of the night to check the nets. Brought them back to a central processing station away from the nets so that we would minimize disturbance at the nets. Weighed them in little cloth bags, took standard measurements. You will note that this is not as exciting work for everybody as photographed each of the individuals and also put them on a small light table to transilluminate the wings, get backlighting on the wings. And you know, somebody's got to ask, well, why do we do that? Thank you. It gives us an indication of scarring from white nose syndrome. All those little white blotches that you see on the wing there and there are scarring from the fungal growth on their wings. This is a fairly minor infection that you see here. The fungus does actually eat the flesh. It produces an enzyme that dissolves the flesh. And I've seen bats that have gaping holes in their wings that have been eaten through by the fungus. These bats were relatively little affected. This is, of course, early in the infection on Long Island. It was only 1 year after it was first found down here, so that's to be expected to some degree. Interestingly enough, we did some more sampling this summer. Don't have a large sample size, but still not seeing anything more severe than that, and that may be very good for bats on Long Island. So what did we find? Well, we captured only 3 species, which was a little discouraging, but they were species that we more or less kind of expected to catch. Big brown bats are not very heavily affected by white nose syndrome. They roost in cooler, drier parts of caves when they hibernate, and the fungus doesn't grow as well in those parts of the cave. So their populations in New York, as of 2012, had been knocked down about 40%, which is relatively minor as far as where some of the other populations have gone. Eastern red bat, of course, they're a tree bat. They don't roost in caves. They are not affected by white nose syndrome. We did expect to find them. In 1902, in historic literature, they were the most common bat found on Long Island. They were by far more common than any other species. So we expected to find those. Northern bat. For those who are not familiar with bat names, some of you may not have heard of northern bat. It used to be called the long-eared bat. Then it was called the northern long-eared bat. Now it's the northern bat. Doesn't really matter what we call it because there aren't any of them left in most of the state. But interestingly enough, we caught 15 of them down here. That was all that was caught in New York State that year. Wow. Okay, nobody else caught it, and that's significant. All in all, we caught about 125 bats, and acoustically, we detected silver-haired bat, little brown bat, eastern small-footed bat, and hoary bat. The eastern small-footed bat, I have the exclamation point near because eastern small-footed bats are known to roost in the summer in rock faces and talus slopes. And if you've looked around Long Island really, really hard, you may notice that we don't have any of that here. So the question is, where are they living? There is anecdotal reports of them being found in buildings, so that's certainly a possibility. And we actually, Tim actually had some folks take a movie camera and put it down in a cistern here on the lab property to see if maybe they were using a cistern that was made of concrete. Didn't find any in the summertime, but we're going to have another look in the winter to see if maybe they're using it for hibernation. But one of the things I suspect is that a lot of these bats do hibernate here on Long Island, even the cave roosting bats. And the question is, we don't have any caves, so where are they hibernating? The logical choice would be buildings, but that may not be the only place. And so we're going to look into doing some further studies, hopefully into the hibernation season, to see if we can't find out where these guys sleep for the winter. So looking at proportions of bat captures, and incidentally, I should have commented first. I've given this presentation now, I think, 3 or 4 times on Long Island at Bats and Brews and at the Northeast Natural History Conference, and earlier this fall at the Pine Barrens Conference. I apologize to anybody who's seen this before, but to make it new, I changed the colors on these graphs. I made the big brown bat brown. By far, the most abundant, most frequently encountered bat was the big brown bat. Not a big surprise, really, given the conditions of being 1 year after the discovery of white nose, primarily because that's what we've seen elsewhere. 1 year after white nose, there seems to be a spike in big brown bats. Eastern red bat represented almost 20% of the capture, and northern bats represented 20% of the capture, which was a surprise. Why? Well, northern bats in the rest of New York State have had a reduction in population of 99%. They're gone in the rest of the state. Why are they still here? Okay, that's a really important question. And there is now thought, I've had a number of discussions with folks from DEC, and we're starting to wonder if Long Island may be a refugium for them. And wouldn't that be exciting? In comparison, Tom Gordon from Suffolk County Community College did some informal surveys, did not publish them, but I was able to get a hold of some of his data. And this gives you an idea of the frequency and species distributions just a few years before, 2004, 2005. He sampled much more widely than I did. He sampled sites all over Long Island, many different habitat types. But you see, there's big brown bat, eastern red bat, and northern bat, but he also found quite a number of little brown bats that represented a quarter of his captures. We detected them acoustically, not very frequently, only 1 or 2 calls. We didn't capture any. And this was, at one time, the most common bat species in the Northeast. And he also detected tricolored bat, which we did not. So quite a change over just a few years. In a post that I actually prepared with a number of folks a few years ago, this was a study that was done at West Point Military Reservation. And this is the frequency distribution of species 1 year after white nose syndrome got there. And you'll see there's some familiar pattern there. A spike in big brown bat, that's Aptesicus fuscus. That's big brown bat there. This is in 2002, 2008, 1 year after white nose. Northern bat, Myotis centrionalis, hasn't been much affected 1 year. So that may be why we had a fair number of them in 2012. Okay. We were hoping to capture more this year. We did, in fact, capture one, but we didn't capture many bats at all this year because we were netting in the full moon. Look at this. Oops. Look at what happens to little brown bats 1 year after. Okay, and we seem to have seen that here as well. Okay, so this is fairly typical for what we've seen in other places. Looking at the comparison of habitat use between burned and unburned sites, we found big brown bats use just about everything. They're sort of the generalists of the bat community. But the burned areas were used much more frequently and significantly from a statistical standpoint. Whether it's significant biologically remains to be seen, depends on how much you believe in statistics. But the northern bats use burned areas far more frequently, and red bats use the unburned areas much more frequently. Just kind of interesting. Why? Because you would think actually it would be reversed, given that the northern bat is a Myotis genus. It's in the genus Myotis. They're small bats. They are adapted for flight below the canopy. They are, northern bats in particular, are also gleaners. Most of the bats that we have capture their prey in midair in flight. They cap flight, like insects. Northern bats are unique. They actually pluck things off of vegetation. They'll catch spiders that way. They'll grab things off of tree trunks. And they're very well adapted to working in a highly cluttered environment. Lots of branches, lots of leaves. So why would they like a burned area better that is all open? As opposed to the red bat, which is a larger species of bat, flies faster, and is typically found in open areas. You would think that the red bat would like being in the burned area better because it's much more open in the understory. But that wasn't the case. So if anybody has any answers or suggestions, come talk to me after the presentation. So, findings and some of the questions we came up with. It's always fun doing studies because you do studies to answer questions, and I have yet to do any of these studies without coming up with more questions than I actually answer. But I suppose that's why we get better and better at finding funding. 3 bat species dominated the captures. Others depleted by white nose syndrome? Probably, yes. And what about the acoustics? Well, we certainly know that there's a wider distribution of species on the island. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to capture hoary bats and silver-haired bats at low elevations. When you get up into the mountains, they tend to fly lower, but down in coastal areas and lower elevation areas, we don't tend to capture them at all. Silver-haired bats, in fact, in New York State, have only been caught 9 times in mist nets. There have only been 9 silver-haired bats ever captured in a mist net. In New York, all of them were males. We've never caught a female in the state. So there are some sampling issues there. Species distribution suggests 1 year post-white nose syndrome. We already knew that, but it was a good confirmation. But the question then stands, the rest of New York State was entirely infected by 2008. Why did it take 3 more years for white nose syndrome to come to Long Island? We know that bats are capable of crossing the Sound. Why did it take 3 more years to get down here? I know the traffic on the bridges gets bad, but it's a real question. And that's what starts to suggest, are the bats here going to the mainland to hibernate, or are they not? Are they, if they're not, then they may have a minimal mixing with the mainland population. And again, that may be what's protecting them and insulating them from it. The questions come up, is Long Island a refugium for northerns? They don't occur anywhere else in the state at this point that we know of. That could very well be. Red bats were most common, or the most common species a little more than 100 years ago. Why the shift? Is it because of the change from agriculture? Long Island is still largely agricultural, but it certainly isn't as much as it would have been in 1902. And red bats like open areas. They are they're the bats you very frequently see flying around lights at night. What happened to them? Is it because it's of the development here? Why have numbers dropped? And red bats seem to prefer the unburned forest, northerns prefer the burned. Why? It should be reversed just by their known behavior. So at this point, what we're really looking for is to continue these studies, looking for more sites to study, more funding to study. We're looking for more funding to study. And so if anybody has any good ideas, please come talk to me. We have had the unfortunate good luck of the fact that in October 2nd of this year, the northern long-eared bat, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that they will be adding the northern long-eared bat to the federal endangered species list. Unfortunate, but good news in that it's unfortunate they're endangered. Fortunate in that that will release some funding to do some further studies. And the fact that we're finding so many northerns here on the island makes this a priority area for study. So stay tuned, and with any luck, I'll be back next year with more data. And I'd like to thank all of these folks. Bat work is extremely labor intensive, so you always need lots and lots of hands, and it's at a time of day when very few people are at their best, at least without a drink in their hand. So if anybody's interested, incidentally, in volunteering, come see me. You can always use more hands. Any questions? Does light pollution have any impact on bats? There's a lot of debate about that. There are a number of folks that suggest that Myotis species bats in particular, some of the smaller bats, avoid lighted areas. And there may be some truth to that because they may be avoiding inter-specific competition with big browns and reds, which are most frequently found at lights. But lights do concentrate prey. And the bottom line is, bats are opportunistic feeders, just like most wild animals, and if there's a concentration of prey, they're going to hit it. And so if there aren't big browns and reds around, I would assume smaller bats would go to lights. I don't think much to suggest that they won't. But Myotis bats are known to use lights less than the larger species. Yes?
What's the status of any treatment or anything like that for white nose, and would it be practical to actually try treatment?
There is research going on the control of white nose, and I think it's now 13 different labs across the country. We do not currently have a control for it. One of the difficulties with fungi is that fungi are particularly hard to kill. It takes very stringent chemical means to kill them. And there are beneficial fungi in the caves that we don't want to kill. Some of them are fed on by insect prey of bats, so we certainly don't want that to climb the ladder. So at this point, no, there is no control for it. There have been some interesting accidental discoveries, things like cider vinegar kills it. And when that was first found out, we had people wanting to put on Indian cans and go into caves and just spray them with vinegar. But at this point, no.
Okay, follow-up. Was it Kentucky or some state actually did an emergency relocation? They built an cave?
Yes, I believe it was in Kentucky, and they've also done it in Maine. This past winter, they tried taking bats out of a natural hibernaculum and putting them in a concrete bunker underground. In Maine, it was an old military bunker, and in Kentucky, it was actually a custom-built concrete cave, with the idea that when the bats left at the end of the winter, they could go in and disinfect the entire thing, because it wasn't a natural cave. And in fact, they had significantly higher survivorship in the bunkers than they did in the natural hibernaculum. So that's being looked at. They're going to try that, I'm sure, again this winter.
Is it overly optimistic to hope that a fungi-resistant population of bats may emerge from this white nose syndrome crisis?
It may be overly optimistic, but that's rarely that frankly is what we're counting on right now. We're hoping that some small percentage of the population is resistant. The fungus, as we understand it, came from Europe. And bats in Europe are not affected by it. But bat densities in Europe are much lower than they are here. So there is some notion that the bat populations in Europe are their recovered bat populations, having been killed off by this fungus hundreds of years ago. The downside is bats reproduce extremely slowly. Most of them only produce one young a year. It'll take more than 100 years for them to recover the populations they had prior to white nose. So none of us will see the populations of bats we once had.
You mentioned the wind turbines, and you were going to talk more about their effect, especially here with wind turbines on Long Island.
Well, I mean, there's nothing particularly special about them here on Long Island, but there are a number of measures that are used to minimize impacts on bats with wind turbines. I don't know if you didn't hear the question. It's discussing impacts of wind turbines on bats. The primary control measure is to shut them down. The good news is that bats tend to fly only when there's very low wind speeds, and wind turbines operate best when there's higher wind speeds. So what a lot of wind companies are doing is they're being asked to shut down their wind turbines when the wind is below a certain threshold. Some of them are doing it. A lot of them are doing it with a great deal of duress because they're losing 1% to 2% of their production out of that. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're a wind power company, that is a lot. So it's a substantial cost to them. But it does seem to help.
So worthwhile building nesting boxes for them, and if so, should they be disinfected every year?
The answer to both those questions is yes, the short answer. Nest boxes certainly do work for bats, but if you come up with the secret of what makes them work for bats, let me know, because I'd like to publish on
I've
that.
seen different plants, some of them, like a rocket box they've got, you have any feedback on that?
There are many different types, and the type of house is really not the critical issue, it's placement that really is the biggest issue. They want the house to be ideally exposed to sunlight for enough time during the day, and here's the hard part, what's enough, to maintain the temperature and humidity regimes that they like. Okay, and different species are going to like different ones. The ones you're going to find, the bats you're going to find in those most frequently are big brown bats.
That's what I heard about the rocket box, because they can actually move around in the box to moderate the temperature. They can, it's too warm, they can move to the cooler side, it's too cool, they can move to the warmer.
Right. I mean, any larger structure is going to provide that to some degree. Also, the color of the box can make a difference. Some people do paint their boxes dark brown or black so they absorb a little more heat. But you really kind of have to experiment. All the literature I've been able to find on bat houses basically says you put it up and you wait 2 years. If they're brand spanking new, they won't. Generally, bats don't go into brand new structures. Wait for it to weather a little bit. If you don't have bats by the end of the second year, move it somewhere else and try again.
We were at a talk at Nequat 2 weeks ago, an Omicron talk, and at night, bats started flying around the room, and out of all of us birders, we had no idea what to do about this bat. We opened the doors, someone would make squeaky sounds.
Did anyone take out a tennis racket? That's what most people do. No, you're doing the right thing. Open a door. Bats echolocate to navigate. They'll find the hole. The other thing is, if you can catch the bat, and don't do it with your bare hands, please. Bats are a rabies vector. But if you can capture the bat, one of the best things to use to capture bats is oven mitts, because they absolutely cannot bite through oven mitts. So those are helpful, or if not, a towel, a jacket, something like that. Wrap up the bat, take it outside, and let it go. Don't touch it with your bare hands, please.
You say that northern bats were pluckers?
They're what are called gleaners, yes.
Gleaners, in other words, they look for instance like on branches and things like that, basically. Now, most of us go out to our woods at night, wouldn't hear what's going on in the woods, between the rusting of the leaves, the branches, and everything. And I think you mentioned that the northerns seem to inhabit the areas that were denuded by the fire. Now, maybe it's a crazy theory, but you don't have all these leaves, you don't have all these branches there now, and they are in tune, they don't have all that clutter. I'm sure they don't have all that clutter themselves in their ears, with sounds. Perhaps now they don't have all that clutter, and they can more zero in on the prey itself. Is that a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
The public scars that we found on the way, on the bats, were those just on the northern bats? Or were they on the
I don't recall specifically, but I think they were on all. I'm pretty sure they were on all. Well, no, I'm sorry, I take that. They were on all the cave roosting, that's the northerns and the big rings.
To volunteer with bats, do you need to take a pre-rabies type shot or anything like that?
No, you don't, but if you don't have a rabies vaccination, you can't touch a bat. You can help me set up nets, you can help me record data, you can photograph, you can do all, there's lots and lots of jobs. but I just can't let you handle the bats themselves.
And how did you say the bats died from the wind turbines? The vacuum?
Yes, they get caught behind in the vacuum behind the blades. What most people don't understand is, turbine blades are 75 feet long on some of the smaller units. Okay, when they're turning at 12 RPMs, the outside edge of that blade is moving at over 200 miles an hour. It creates quite a suction behind it, and the bats may fly somewhere near it, and we're not sure why they would fly near it, but when they do it, when they caught in that vacuum, and the sudden drop in pressure explodes the alveoli in their lungs.
We have time for one more question, I'm going to have to cut it off.
Do you have any idea why the green pool umbrellas end up getting so many bats where bat has to go? I mean, it's not uncommon for people to say they opened up their umbrella near a pool for a bat to come out. And yet, it's so infrequent for somebody to put the bat box to get a bat. Any of you want?
I don't, but I've actually considered selling patio umbrellas as bat houses because I think they work. Why is not important, it's that they work.
A lot of times they're out in the sun and people put the bat boxes up on trees and their shade is
That's true.
being too cold.
That's true.
Not even having light umbrellas.
Okay, thank you very much.